The strangest 4 verses in the whole Bible are sitting inside Genesis 6, a chapter you have read 100 times. Every flood movie summarized them in one sentence. Then the rain starts and the story moves on. Tonight, you read them line by line. The earth was full. 2 family lines. One built cities and sang songs about killing. The other knelt down and called on the name of God. And then the lines blurred, and something broke. 4 verses, 3 words in Hebrew, 2,000 years of argument, and one question nobody has settled. I want to be straight with you about something before we start. For years, I read Genesis 6 the same lazy way most people do. Flood coming, build a boat, 2 of every animal. I treated it like a title card before the real movie. Then one quiet evening, I actually slowed down on verses 1 through 4, and I could not get up from the table.
These verses are not a typo in Scripture. They are not filler the movie studios were right to cut. They are some of the oldest, strangest, most carefully preserved words in the book. And they have been hiding in plain sight in your own Bible the whole time. So here is what I am promising you tonight, and I mean every word of it. I am not going to hand you a verdict and tell you to swallow it. I am going to walk you through the actual Hebrew, the actual readings that faithful people have held for centuries, and I'm going to let you weigh them with your own heart and your own pastor. I have been sitting with this chapter alone for years, long after I stepped back from leading worship, and it has never stopped asking me questions. By the time we are done tonight, you will never read this chapter the same way. Not because I showed you something sensational, because I showed you what was already there. Part 2. The world before Genesis 6 opens. Before you can understand what breaks in Genesis 6, you have to see the world that was already cracking. Genesis 6 opens with a single establishing shot. The King James puts it this way: "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them." That is it. 1 verse, 1 motion. Men began to multiply. The earth that started with 1 man and 1 woman in a garden is now crowded. Cities are rising. Tents stretch to the horizon. Children everywhere. Ordinary life, ordinary mornings, ordinary weddings. The text spends 1 verse, just letting the world fill up. Hold on to that ordinariness, because the very next verse is where the ground starts to shift under your feet. But before we read it, I need to back you up. Because Genesis 6 does not arrive out of nowhere. The chapters before it have been quietly laying 2 tracks side by side, 2 family lines, 2 bloodlines running in completely different directions. And everything that breaks in chapter 6 depends on understanding what those 2 lines became. Part 3. 2 bloodlines, the line that built and the line that knelt. Let me start with the line that walked away from God. After Cain kills his brother Abel and is sent out from the presence of the Lord, the text says something quietly enormous. Genesis 4:17. "And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he built a city and called the name of it after his son." Read that again. The first city in the Bible is built by the first murderer, and he names it after his boy. Picture that scene. A man marked by God, exiled, restless. He should be wandering. Instead, he builds. Walls go up east of Eden, streets, gates. A name carved over the entrance. Civilization itself is born from a man running from his guilt. I've come to read that detail as one of the most human moments in all of Scripture, because I know that impulse. When I cannot face what I have done, I want to build something, anything, to fill the silence. Cain builds a city, Most of us build careers or reputations or walls around ourselves instead. The text does not call it evil to build. It simply tells you where the building started. Then watch the line curdle over the generations. A few names down the list sits a man named Lamech, and Lamech does something no one in Genesis has done yet. He composes a song, and the first song recorded in the entire Bible is a song about killing. Genesis 4:23 and 24. I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Hear what happened in just a handful of verses. Cain's violence was met by God's restraint. God put a mark on him and kept the world from tearing him apart. But Lamech takes vengeance and turns it into a boast, into music, into something he sings to his wives like a trophy. The sword has become a song. The wound has become a family tradition. In a few short generations, one act of violence has multiplied into a whole culture that celebrates blood. That is how the text quietly shows you a world filling up with darkness, long before chapter 6 ever names it. Now the camera cuts to the other line, the other reel. After all that darkness, Genesis 4 ends on a single line that lands like a held breath. Genesis 4:26. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. After the city, after the sword song. Somewhere in the line of Seth, people start to pray out loud. They start calling on the name. The film finally has a counter melody. I want to be honest with you. For most of my life, I skipped those genealogy lists entirely. Names I couldn't pronounce, ages I couldn't believe. It wasn't until I was sitting in my kitchen one winter, worn down by a hard season, that Genesis 4:26 finally landed on me. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. I used to think those name lists were the boring part you endure to get to the real stories. Now I think they might be the whole point. Two families, one builds to forget, one kneels to remember. I am still working out most days which line I am actually living in. Part 4. Enoch, the man who didn't die. Now stay with me because there is one more man in the line of Seth we have to meet before we can walk into chapter 6. A man who did not die. Walk up the line of Seth, generation by generation, until you reach a man the text treats differently from everyone around him. His name is Enoch, not Cain's son Enoch, a different Enoch in the faithful line. The Bible says he is the seventh from Adam. Genesis 5 is a chapter built almost entirely on a single drum beat. So-and-so lived so many years, and he died, and he died, and he died. The refrain repeats down the whole page like a funeral bell tolling in the same key for every name on the list. And then it reaches Enoch, and the bell stops. Genesis 5:24. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Let that sit for a second, because it breaks the pattern on purpose. Everyone else in the chapter dies. Enoch does not. He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The text does not over-explain it. It does not give us a scene or a chariot or a sky splitting open. It simply says he walked with God so closely that one day he was gone, taken. Most teachers I grew up under read right past Enoch in a single breath, but I have come to believe this short verse is one of the most hopeful lines in the early Bible. In a chapter where death wins every single round, 930 years, 912, 905, one man slips the hold of death, not by strength, not by strategy, by walking with God. File Enoch away carefully, because his name is going to matter when we get to the strangest question of the chapter. Part 5. The world is full and the lines are blurring. Step back and look at the whole stage we have built. On one side, the line of Cain, a city raised in exile, a sword song sung with pride, a culture learning to celebrate its own violence. On the other side, the line of Seth, men calling on the name of the Lord. Enoch walking so close to God that he has simply taken two bloodlines, two trajectories. Every name, every birth, every death pouring into one single moment. The earth is filling up. The text told us that at the start of chapter 6, men began to multiply on the face of the earth. The world is getting crowded. And the two lines are no longer staying on their own sides of the story. That is the world Genesis 6 walks into. Not an empty planet, a full one. A world with cities and songs and prayers and graves. A world where the faithful line and the wandering line are now living shoulder to shoulder. Their children are growing up on the same streets. And it is right here, with the world full and the lines blurring and the noise building to the ceiling of history, that the chapter opens its mouth and says the strangest thing in the Bible. The sons of God saw the daughters of men. Something is about to break. Part 6. Ben Ha-Elohim. The three words that split the room. Read verse 2 slowly, exactly as the King James gives it. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives, of all which they chose. Stop right there. The sons of God, the daughters of men, they saw, they chose, they took. In the Hebrew, that phrase, the sons of God, is Ben Ha-Elohim. Three little words. Most English Bibles hand them to you smooth and easy, and you read right over them. But the people who have studied this for centuries do not agree on what those three words mean. And I want to be honest with you up front. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I have settled a question that faithful readers have argued over for 2,000 years. What I can do is lay it out plain the way I wish someone had laid it out for me years ago when I first started taking these 4 verses seriously. Here is why the phrase carries so much weight. That exact phrase, Ben Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, does not only appear here in Genesis 6, it shows up in the book of Job twice, in passages where the meaning is a little clearer. Job 1:6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And again in Job 38:7, where God himself is speaking and describes the dawn of creation. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Read those 2 passages again in your mind. In Job, the sons of God are gathered in a heavenly court, standing before the throne of God, singing at the foundation of the world, before a single human being had drawn breath. There is no way to read them as ordinary men in those passages. They are clearly members of God's heavenly assembly. So one careful reading of Genesis 6 asks a fair question. If the very same phrase means heavenly beings over in Job, should it not at least be considered to mean something similar here? That is not a wild leap. That is just reading the Bible with the Bible, letting the same words speak with the same voice across the same text. And here's the part that surprises people. This reading is old. Before the time of Christ, when Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the version scholars call the Septuagint, some manuscripts rendered this very phrase as the angels of God, not the sons of God. The angels of God. I am not telling you that translation settles the question. It does not. I am telling you it is ancient, and it shows you how some of the earliest readers already leaned long before any of us arrived. Before the time of Christ, Jewish translators looked at these 3 words and reached for the word angels. That should at least make you slow down. Part 7. 3 readings, lay them out fairly. There are 3 serious readings of who these sons of God are. I am not going to force a verdict on you. I am going to walk you through all 3 fairly and let you weigh them with your own heart and your own pastor. That is the only honest way to handle a verse this heavy. Reading 1. The Fallen Angels. The first reading is the oldest and the most cinematic. In this reading, the sons of God are fallen angels, heavenly beings who crossed a line they were never meant to cross and came down to the daughters of men. Where does this reading come from? A large part of it comes from the body of ancient writing scholars call Second Temple literature, the books and traditions that grew up among Jewish believers in the centuries between the Old and New Testaments. The loudest voice in that tradition is a book called First Enoch. Let me be clear about what First Enoch is and what it is not. It is an ancient book written down well before the time of Jesus that takes these 4 verses in Genesis 6 and expands them into a long, vivid story. In that story, the heavenly beings are called the Watchers. They descend. They take wives. They teach humanity forbidden knowledge. Their offspring become the giants. I am not telling you First Enoch carries the same authority as Genesis. It does not, and I would never claim that. What I am telling you is that this is one ancient tradition, clearly labeled as a tradition, and it shaped how a great many early readers understood this chapter. You deserve to know it exists. Here is the part that surprises most people who grew up in church. This Watcher tradition does not stay locked away in old books nobody opened. It leaves a footprint directly inside your New Testament. Turn to the little book of Jude, verse 6. Speaking of judgment, Jude writes, "And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day." Angels who kept not their first estate. Angels who left their own habitation. Read that sentence slowly. Many readers across the centuries have connected that verse straight back to Genesis 6, to heavenly beings who abandoned the place God gave them. And Jude is not alone. The Apostle Peter says something nearly identical in 2 Peter 2:4. "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment." Angels that sinned, cast down. Chains of darkness. I have sat with those 2 verses for a long time, and here is where I have landed for now. I cannot prove to you that Jude and Peter are pointing only at Genesis 6. I will not pretend I can. But I understand why so many faithful readers, ancient and modern, have heard the echo. The shape of it lines up. That is reading 1. Ancient, widely held, leaving a footprint in the New Testament. Hold it loosely with me and let me show you the second. Reading 2. The line of Seth. The second reading takes you in a completely different direction. For a lot of people who grew up in church, this is the one you were quietly handed without anyone calling it a theory. In this reading, the sons of God are not angels at all. They are men. Specifically, they are the godly line of Seth, the faithful line we walked up earlier, the men who began to call upon the name of the Lord. And the daughters of men are the women of the line of Cain, the wandering line, the city builders, the ones carrying Lamech's sword song in their blood. So the sin in Genesis 6 is not heaven invading earth. The sin is the covenant family marrying out. The holy line and the worldly line blending together until you cannot tell them apart anymore. I want to be honest with you because I owe you that. For most of my life, this is the reading I held without ever questioning it. 14 years, I stood up front as a worship leader, and if you had asked me back then, I would have told you the sons of God were Seth's people, plain and simple. No debate. It was clean. It kept the angels out of it. It made chapter 6 a lesson about not being unequally yoked, and I could preach that on a Sunday morning without anyone getting nervous. Then in 2019, I stepped back and read the whole thing slowly, alone. And I had to admit something to myself. I had been choosing that reading partly because it was comfortable, not only because the text forced it. That shook me a little. My position now is that it is a strong reading, but it is not the slam dunk I once thought it was. I had to learn to hold it with an open hand. Here is the honest strength and weakness of it. The strength is real. It fits the flow of the story. Genesis 4 gave us Cain's line. Chapter 5 gave us Seth's line. So by the time chapter 6 opens, you already have two families on the stage. Reading the sons of God as Seth's faithful men keeps the whole thing human and grounded. And it fits a theme that runs through the entire Bible: the danger of God's people losing their distinctness by blending with the world around them. That is a sturdy reading, and I respect the people who hold it. But here is the honest weakness. The text does not say Sethites and Canaanites. It says sons of God and daughters of men. And that exact phrase, sons of God, means heavenly beings over in Job. So the Seth reading has to explain why the same three words mean angels in one book and faithful human men in another. That is a fair question, and I will not pretend it has an easy answer. Reading 3, the God Kings. Now let me show you the third reading, because this one is the one I came to last in my own study. And it is held by serious people too. In this reading, the sons of God are neither angels nor Seth's line. They are kings, rulers, powerful men who called themselves sons of the gods. To understand this, you have to remember what the ancient world looked like. In the lands all around early Israel, the great kings claimed divine descent. A pharaoh, a Mesopotamian king, would put divine titles on himself the way a man today puts a logo on a building. So in this third reading, Genesis 6 is describing a world where these god kings, dynastic rulers who wore divinity like a crown, used their power to take any woman they wanted. Look back at the wording. They saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Of all which they chose. That phrase in this reading points to raw power. Rulers seizing women by force because no one on earth could stop them. And it connects naturally to the phrase that closes verse 4. Men of renown. Because what is a tyrant building, if not a name, a dynasty? A legend of his own greatness? I find this reading genuinely interesting. I am not endorsing it over the other two. I am telling you it is a third serious option that thoughtful readers hold. You deserve to know it is on the table. Part 8. What all three readings agree on. Now let me lay all three side by side, not to force a winner, to show you what they share. Reading 1. Sons of God are fallen angels, heavenly beings who left their place. The reading the oldest traditions and the echoes in Jude and Peter lean toward. Reading 2. Sons of God are the godly line of Seth, faithful men marrying into the worldly line of Cain until the covenant family loses its distinctness. Reading 3. Sons of God are dynastic God kings, tyrants who claimed divine descent and took women by power. 3 readings, held by faithful people for 2,000 years. Now here is the thing I believe is the most important observation in this whole segment. Do not rush past it. Look at what all 3 readings agree on. Every single one of them says the same thing underneath. A line was crossed. A boundary God set was violated. Whether you read it as heaven invading earth, or the holy mixing with the unholy, or the powerful crushing the weak, the heart of the matter does not change. Something that was supposed to stay separate got mixed together, and the mixing brought ruin. That agreement across 3 readings that disagree on everything else tells you the chapter is pointing at one thing: transgression, a limit broken. And anyone who tells you this question is fully settled by that one reading has won and the debate is over is telling you more than the text actually says. What I will tell you is this: take all three to your own pastor, your own study, your own knees. Weigh them with your own heart. The honest believer can hold this question with reverence and still not have it nailed shut. And that is not a failure of faith. That is the text working the way the text was built to work. Part 9. God speaks. The Spirit will not always strive. After all that argument about who the sons of God were, the Lord Himself finally speaks. And the whole chapter goes quiet to listen. Here is what He says, word for word, in Genesis 6:3. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. Read that again slowly. My spirit shall not always strive with man. This is the first time in the chapter God speaks out loud. And notice what He does not start with. Not rage. Not the language of a judge announcing a sentence. He starts with a verdict about patience. Something has reached its limit. Sit with that word. Strive. For chapter after chapter, since the garden, God's Spirit has been wrestling with humanity, holding back, calling people to turn, putting up with rebellion the way a parent puts up with a child who keeps walking toward the road. Cain killed his brother, and God still marked him for protection. Lamech sang a song of vengeance, and the world kept turning. The Spirit kept striving, kept reaching, kept holding the door open. And now the Lord says, this will not go on forever. There is a limit to how long mercy waits while a heart refuses to come home. I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because the text says it. And I have learned not to soften the lines that make me uncomfortable. Then comes the reason. And it is a heavy one. For that He also is flesh. 4 words. God names the human limit. Man is flesh, not eternal, bent toward the ground he was made from. I used to read that line as God being harsh, almost cold. I do not read it that way anymore. Now I hear something closer to grief in it. A father looking at his children and saying, "You are only flesh, and flesh cannot keep going like this." And then in the same breath, the Lord attaches a number. 120 years. Here, honest readers split again, and I want to give you both sides fairly. The first reading says this is a new ceiling on the human lifespan. Up until now, Genesis 5 had people living 800, 900 years. Methuselah, almost 1,000. In this reading, God is shortening the human life. The long centuries are being pulled down to something closer to what we know today. The second reading hears something different. In this reading, the 120 years is not about lifespan at all. It is a countdown. The grace window. The time God will hold back the flood. One man building a boat on dry ground while the world watches and laughs. God is not measuring how long people will live. He is measuring how long He will hold back the water. He is setting a timer on His own mercy. I have gone back and forth on both, and I hold it loosely. Faithful people I respect land on both sides. But here is what both readings share. Either way, the clock starts. Whether the 120 years is the length of a life or the length of a warning, time just became limited. The open-ended patience of the early chapters now has a number on it. And once there is a number, there is an ending. The world Genesis has been describing just got a deadline. Part 10. The Nephilim, what the word actually says. Now read Genesis 6:4 with me, because this is the verse that launched 1,000 movies. And almost none of them got it from the actual text. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. There were giants in the earth in those days. Stop right there. The Hebrew word the King James translators rendered as giants is the word Nephilim. And I want to be careful here because this is the verse where people stop reading the Bible and start writing their own. I want to be honest with you the way I wish more people had been honest with me when I first started taking this seriously on my own. The word Nephilim appears, and the chapter does not stop to explain it. It does not give us a height. It does not give us a measurement. It does not describe their faces or tell us how many there were. One careful reading traces the word back to a Hebrew root, nafal, a word that means to fall. The fallen ones, the ones who fell, or the ones who cause others to fall. I find that reading compelling, and I have sat with it for a while. I will tell you plainly, I held a completely different picture in my head for years. I read this verse exactly the way the movies trained me to read it. I pictured creatures 40 feet tall stepping over forests, snapping trees like matchsticks. It took me a long time to go back to the actual Hebrew and notice how little the text really claims. Read Genesis 6:4 again with fresh eyes. It does not say how tall they were. It does not describe their faces. It does not measure a single bone. The word nafal and that sense of falling may be pointing less at the size of their bodies and more at the state of their nature. Fallen, brought low, something that descended from where it was supposed to stay. That is one reading I have come to respect. I offer it as exactly that. One reading among faithful readers, not the final word from on high. Now let me be careful here because this is the doorway where a lot of sincere people wander off and never find their way back to the Bible itself. There are older writings, First Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, that take these few verses and build entire worlds on top of them. Giants of impossible size, named spirits, long elaborate accounts of the descent and its aftermath. I want to be clear about what those books are. They are ancient voices expanding on the small seed Genesis plants. Some traditions, including the Ethiopian church, have treasured First Enoch for centuries, and I honor that they kept it and read it carefully. But those expansions are not Genesis 6. I do not treat them as scripture quietly filling its own gaps. The 4 verses in front of us stay restrained on purpose, and I think that restraint is itself telling us something. So I hold the text in one hand and the tradition in the other, and I keep them separate. That distinction has kept me grounded for years. Now look at what verse 4 actually does say, because the next phrase is where the real weight comes down. These figures, whoever they were, became, in the words of the King James, mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Mighty men. The Hebrew word behind it is gibber, the strong ones, the warriors, the champions whose names carried weight in a room before they ever opened their mouths. The text tells us the world knew their names, and it knew them for one reason: power, men of renown. In the Hebrew, it is almost literally men of the name, men who made a name for themselves. And I want you to catch what kind of name that is, because it is not the kind of name God hands out. This is fame built on strength, reputation built on conquest, the world's heroes, the legends people told around the fire at night, the warriors whose victories got remembered and whose victims got quietly forgotten. When I was a young worship leader, I assumed greatness in the Bible always looked like David standing before Goliath. It took me years of reading alone to notice that Genesis 6 is showing me a completely different kind of greatness. The kind the world celebrates and heaven grieves. The kind that builds a name out of everyone it stepped on. And do not miss 4 small words tucked in the middle of verse 4. And also after that, there were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that. The verse is quietly telling you that these figures were not only a pre-flood thing. In some form, the text says they show up again later. Many readers connect that line forward to Numbers 13:33, when the spies come back from the promised land terrified and say, "And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants." The same Hebrew word echoes there. I will not claim I have it all locked down, but the text plants the seed with those 4 words. And also after that, Part 11, the heaviest sentence in Genesis. Now the camera pulls back from the giants and the heroes and the famous names, and for the first time in the chapter, it turns all the way inside the human being. Here is Genesis 6:5, word for word in the King James. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Read that again slowly. I will wait, because that is one of the heaviest sentences in the whole Bible. And the world we just walked through, the crowded earth, the blurred bloodlines, the men of renown, all of it collapses into one diagnosis. God saw. Start there. The verse does not say God heard the noise or counted the bodies. It says God saw the wickedness, and the Hebrew here means he looked and he perceived. He looked all the way down to the root. And what was the root? Not the buildings, not the swords, not even the violence the giants left behind. The verse goes underneath all of that, down to a place no human eye can reach. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart. In Hebrew thinking, the heart is not just where you feel, it is where you decide, where you plan, where you become who you are in the quiet before anyone is watching. And that is exactly where God looked. I want you to feel how far this goes, because it would have been easier to read if it stopped at the actions. If God had just said their deeds were evil, I could keep this story at arm's length. Bad people did bad things, and they got what was coming. But the verse will not let me stand that far back. It says the problem was not only what their hands did, it was what their hearts imagined before their hands ever moved. The corruption had gone all the way to the source. The well itself was poisoned, not just the water coming out of it. Now look at 2 small words, because everything turns on them, only and continually. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, not mostly evil, not evil in seasons, not evil with stretches of light in between, only, continually, without break. The 2 words slam the door on any version of this where humanity is basically fine with a few rough edges. The verdict is total, and it is constant. I want to bring this close to home, the way I would with my own son at the kitchen table. When you are completely alone, when no one is watching, when there is no camera and no consequence, what runs through your heart? Not your best self, the one you put on in public, the real stream underneath. I have asked myself that, and the answer humbled me. This verse was never meant to stay safely back in the ancient world with people we can look down on. It is a verse about the human heart, the same heart you and I carry every single day. The first time that landed on me, sitting alone with my Bible a few years after stepping back from leading worship, I had to put the book down for a minute. I thought about my mother. She was a deaconess. She knew this book. And I can almost hear how she would have read this verse out loud and then gone quiet. Because there's no easy way to soften it. The wickedness was great, not small, not occasional, not a few bad actors in an otherwise decent world. The whole stream of human imagination running in one direction, and that direction was away from God. I still cannot read this verse casually. I do not think it was meant to be read casually. Part 12. The grief that most preachers skipped. Now look at what comes directly after that heaviest sentence, because it is the verse that changed how I see God. Here is Genesis 6:6, word for word, in the King James. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. Stop there. Read it one more time. It grieved him at his heart. Please notice, what it does not say. It does not say God was furious. It does not lead with rage. After the verdict, after the full diagnosis of corruption, the first word out of this verse is grief. Now I have to slow down and be careful, because that word repented trips a lot of sincere people up. And it tripped me up for years. It does not mean God made a mistake and wished he could take it back the way you and I repent of something foolish. The Hebrew word carries the sense of being moved, being grieved, a deep turning of the heart in response to what has happened. God is not confessing an error. The same Bible tells us elsewhere that God does not change the way we change. So here is how I have come to read it, and you are free to read it differently. This is the Bible reaching for human words to describe something almost too tender to say out loud. The Maker is looking at what his creation has become, and his heart breaks. It grieved him at his heart. Sit in that phrase. Not, it angered him in his justice. Though the justice is real, and it is coming. It grieved him at his heart. And now notice something the text does quietly. The same word, heart, that described the corruption of man in verse 5 now describes the sorrow of God in verse 6. Man's heart, only evil continually. God's heart, grieved by it. The text just placed God's heart right next to man's heart on the same page. This is not a distant deity flicking away an experiment that failed. This is a father at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. I will tell you something I do not say lightly. I grew up hearing the flood preached as wrath, pure and simple, a God who had run out of patience and was done. And for a long stretch of my life, that kept God at a cold distance from me. It was reading this one verse, really reading it alone. A few years after I left the church I had served for 14 years, that broke something open in me. The flood does not begin with rage. It begins with a broken heart. The night that landed on me, I sat with my Bible open and I thought about my own children, Malik and Imani, and what it would do to me to watch them walk somewhere I could not follow them. I do not claim to fully understand the heart of God, but I felt just for a second the edge of something I had never touched before in all my years on that platform. And I have never read Genesis 6 the same way since. Here is the most important thing in the whole chapter, and it is the thing the movies never film. The heart of Genesis 6 is not the giants. It is not the wrath. It is the grief. Most retellings I have seen reach for the spectacle, the towering Nephilim, the rising water, the ark splitting waves. But the text itself spends its weight somewhere else entirely, on a God who can be grieved by what he loves. And I think we miss that because a God who only judges is easier to manage than a God who grieves. A judge you can keep at a distance. A father with a broken heart pulls you in close, and that is harder to hold. Think about what it means that God can grieve at all. You do not grieve over what you never cared about. You do not weep over a stranger. Grief is the price of love. The very fact that the Lord is grieved tells you he never stopped loving the world he was about to wash clean. I had this completely backwards for years. I thought the flood proved God had run out of love. I have come to believe it proves the opposite. He loved enough to be wounded by what sin had done to the people he made. The wrath is real, but the wrath is grief with nowhere left to go. Part 13. The verdict. I will destroy after the grief. The verdict gets a voice. Here is what the Lord says next. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air. For it repenteth me that I have made them. This is the flood announced before a single drop has fallen. The water is still years away, but the word is already spoken. And notice what the verse refuses to let us separate. I will destroy. And in the same breath, it repenteth me that I have made them. The judgment and the grief are sitting in the same sentence. They are not two different moods coming from two different places. They are one heart, a heart that is breaking even as it decides. That is the part most retellings get wrong, and I held it wrong for years. We picture a furious God slamming a door. The text gives us a grieving father speaking the hardest words a father can speak about the children he made with his own hands. Listen to how wide that judgment reaches. Both man and beast and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air. The whole created order named here is the same order God called good back in chapter 1. The same God who made it is the one now speaking over it. I do not pretend to fully understand a judgment that wide. I have sat with this verse in the dark more than once and not come up with a tidy answer. What I have come to believe is that the text is not asking me to defend God's anger. It is asking me to feel the weight of what sin had done to a world he loved enough to grieve. The verdict is real, but the verdict is grief with a voice. Part 14. The Great But. Grace appears for the first time. And then comes one of the most important words in the entire Bible. One short word. After the verdict, after I will destroy, after the whole condemned world. The very next verse turns on a single hinge. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. But, the great but of Genesis 6. The whole chapter has been falling, and that one word catches it. Read it again. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Everything before it was judgment. Everything after it is rescue. And the door between the two is 3 letters wide. Now sit with something. This is the part that still moves me when I read it. This is the first time the word grace appears in the entire Bible. Genesis 6:8. Not in Eden, not at creation, not at the altar of Abel. Here, in the darkest chapter the book has given us so far, in the middle of a death sentence over the whole earth, the word grace shows up for the very first time. I find that almost unbearable in the best way. Grace does not make its debut in a garden. It makes its debut in a graveyard. The first time the Bible breathes that word, it breathes it over one man standing in a world that has run out of mercy everywhere else. I want to tell you when that landed on me, because I did not always see it. A few years after I stepped away from the church I had served for 14 years in Birmingham, I was reading Genesis straight through again, slow, just me and the page. I had read this verse my whole life and skated right past it. But that night I stopped on the word but, and I sat at my kitchen table in Atlanta, and I stayed there a long time. I used to read this chapter as a story about wrath. It took me longer than I would like to admit to see that it is actually a story about one man and a God who would not let go. I thought grace was a New Testament word. I was wrong. It was here the whole time, hiding in plain sight, waiting in verse 8. Part 15. Who was Noah? Not flawless, just faithful. One man, not a nation, not an army, not a majority, one. The whole story of the flood, the whole future of the human race, the whole line that leads to everything that comes after. It hangs on one man who found grace, So what was it about Noah? Why him? The very next verse tells us, and it is not what most of us assume. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Read that last line one more time. Noah walked with God. If you have been with me through this whole film, that phrase should make you sit up, because we have heard it before. Back in chapter 5, there was another man the text said walked with God. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, who walked with God and was not, for God took him. And now, generations later, in the worst hour the world has seen, the Bible reaches for the exact same words. Noah walked with God. The same footpath, the same posture. One man who kept walking when the whole earth had stopped. Let me handle that word perfect carefully. Perfect in his generations. I do not read that as sinless, and I do not think the text is asking us to. The Hebrew word carries the sense of being whole, complete, sound, blameless in his walk before God. Here is how I have come to understand it, and you are free to weigh it for yourself. Noah was not perfect the way only God is perfect. He was a man of integrity in a generation that had none. What made Noah remarkable was not that he had no fault. It was that he stayed faithful, whole, upright, when faithfulness had become the rarest thing on earth. Most teachers I came up under preached Noah as flawless. I have landed somewhere different. The phrase in his generations is doing specific work. It is measuring Noah against his world. Verse 5 just told us every imagination of the thoughts of men's hearts was only evil continually. That is the air Noah breathed. That is the street he walked down every morning. That is the generation his children were growing up in. And in that world, this one man kept walking with God. Righteousness is impressive in a good season. Righteousness in a corrupt world, when nobody around you is doing it, and nobody is watching, and there is no reward for it, and people probably laughed at you every morning. That is a different kind of thing entirely. That is the Noah the text is showing us. Not flawless. Faithful when faithfulness cost everything. Part 16, the Ark, the Covenant, the first word of promise. And because of that walk, God gives this one man a commission that sounds impossible. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. Gopher wood. We are not even fully certain today what tree that was. Some kind of resinous timber, the kind that could be sealed. And then come the measurements, exact, like a blueprint. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A cubit is roughly the length of a forearm, about 18 inches. Do that math, and you are looking at a vessel the length of 1.5 football fields. Rooms inside, pitch sealing every seam against the water that is coming. God did not hand Noah a vision. He handed him a spec sheet. But the ark is not the heart of the commission. Look at verse 18, word for word. But with thee will I establish my covenant. There it is again. But, the same hinge from verse 8. Only now it opens onto something even bigger. With thee will I establish my covenant. This is the first time the word covenant appears in the whole Bible. In the middle of a death sentence over the entire earth, God is making a promise. He is not just saving one man's life, he is binding himself to one man's future. The flood is coming to end a world. And inside that ending, God is already speaking the language of a beginning. And here is how the chapter closes. And I think it is one of the quietest, most powerful lines in all of Genesis. Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, so did he. That is it. No speech, no argument, no record of Noah asking why or how or what the neighbors would say while he built a boat the size of a stadium on dry ground for decades. Thus did Noah. He just did it. And I will be honest, that obedience humbles me, because I am a man who asks a lot of questions before I move. And Noah asks none that the text bothers to write down. He heard God. He picked up the gopher wood. He started building. So did he. 3 small words that carried the whole human race through the water. Part 17. The Ethiopian Witness. A fuller conversation Africa kept. Before I leave you, I want to mention something I have been holding back. And I want to be careful with how I say it. The story we just walked is not only told in Genesis. There are 2 older Jewish writings, First Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, that take these same verses and expand on them, filling in scenes around the sons of God and the giants in far more detail. And here is the part many people in the Western Church have never been told. Those books were not lost. They were carefully kept for centuries in the Ethiopian Church. They still sit inside the Ethiopian Bible to this day. When the Ethiopian Orthodox Church opens its canon, those books are in it. They have been read and studied and carried through wars and famines, and the falling of empires by African believers who never let them go. I bring that up as restoration, not as a rewrite. I am not telling you to treat First Enoch or Jubilees as equal to Genesis. Genesis is the text we are building on. Those books are expansions, ancient voices working with the same small seed the text plants in chapter 6. I treat them as cross-references, held carefully in the other hand. But many of us in the Black church grew up never hearing that an African church preserved a wider witness to these very chapters. That is worth knowing. It honors how big and how old this primeval story really is, without anyone needing to claim their corner of it, is the only true one. The Ethiopian canon kept a fuller conversation alive. We can enter it with humility and let Genesis stay the anchor. Part 18. Conclusion. Here is where I want to leave you. And I mean every word of this. Think back to where we started. 4 verses. Just 4. The ones most Bible movies fly over in a single sentence if they mention them at all. The sons of God, the daughters of men, the giants in the earth, the mighty men of renown. Those 4 verses are not a strange footnote tucked into Genesis. They are the doorway into the single most important turn in the early Bible, the hinge. The whole flood swings on. Everything before them leads up. Everything after flows out. Read them as one motion and watch where they travel. Corruption, then a grief so deep it broke the heart of God, then a verdict over the whole earth, and then, on one small word, but the story turns from judgment to grace and lands on one faithful man. Grief to grace in one chapter. The world before Noah and the world after Noah hang on these lines. Here are the 3 things I want you to carry out of tonight. First, the grief in verse 6 is not a detail to move past on your way to the ark. It is the point. A God who grieves over sin is a God who loved enough to be wounded by it. The flood is not evidence that God ran out of love. It is evidence that love and justice, when they cannot be separated, produce grief. And grief with nowhere left to go becomes judgment. Hold both of those together before you form your picture of who God is. Second, the 3 readings of who the sons of God were are not a sign that the Bible is unclear. They are a sign that the text carries more weight than any single reading can hold. If you have been carrying one reading your whole life without questioning it, the way I carried the Sethite reading for 14 years, I am not asking you to abandon it. I am asking you to hold it with an open hand. Let the text be bigger than the reading you brought to it. Third, grace appears for the first time in the darkest chapter. Not in the garden, not at creation, here, in the graveyard. If you are in a season right now that feels more like the condemned world of verse 7 than the garden of chapter 2, If you are in a place where everything around you feels only and continually, remember where grace made its first appearance in the whole Bible, in the middle of a death sentence, on one man who just walked. Open Genesis chapter 6 tonight with your own Bible and your own heart. Read those 4 verses slow. Read the grief in verse 6. Read the but in verse 8. You may land somewhere different than I did. And if you do, that is exactly how it should be. The text is big enough to hold both of us.